The case of the husband accused of killing his pregnant wife just became more shocking.
Just sitting out here with my coffee this morning thinking about software pricing.
This was Lee Gilley on LinkedIn before he became an accused killer in 2024. He was set to go on trial next month, but then he vanished. Now authorities halfway across the world have him in custody. How a man was able to escape the country as he's facing a charge of capital murder. We're on the case, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Chris Stewart. There are not many defendants facing capital murder charges who are able to prepare for trial at home. It doesn't seem like Lee Gilley is going to be able to have that luxury anymore after what he just allegedly pulled. Authorities have him in custody in Italy. And I'll tell you in a moment what he told authorities when they pulled him aside in Milan. We'll also talk a little bit about some of the new evidence that prosecutors have laid out in recent weeks against this dad turned alleged killer. But before I get into all of that, I want to bring you up to speed on this case and what this man is accused of doing. So this is Lee and his wife, Christa. This seems to be a Christmas morning years ago. Social media shows that this couple was married roughly in 2017, and they seem to have so much going for them. Frankly, Lee seemed to have so much going for him. They lived in a great house in Houston, and according to LinkedIn, Lee worked in the software industry.
As you know, we're a software consultancy, and I just went through the process of helping a friend select a software vendor.
At home, the couple also reportedly had 2 children, and they were expecting a third in 2024. But then October 7th, 2024 is when everything changed. Houston police say they were called to the couple's home around 11:30 p.m. That call initially came in as a suicide or an overdose. Lee claimed to have found his wife, Christa, unresponsive. She was taken to a hospital and she was pronounced dead. Not only did she lose her life, but she lost her unborn child as well. Christa was 9 weeks pregnant at the time of her death. Lee was the one who allegedly called 911, and he allegedly said that his wife had gone to bed 3 hours before he did, and then he went into their room, and that's when he found her. Court documents say that he told doctors that his wife wasn't suicidal or a drug user. Seems like he was claiming he had no idea what happened to his wife. The couple's 2 young children, they were also at home when all of this allegedly happened, when their mom lost her life. Now, even though police say Lee was claiming that he didn't know what happened, authorities are now saying the truth. It is allegedly more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. Court documents show that Christa's injuries were allegedly consistent with strangulation. Doctors also show that Lee allegedly admitted that the couple had been arguing the night that she died. Now, this couple, they appeared to have a perfect marriage, but prosecutors are alleging that Lee had some very concerning behavior in the years leading up to Christa's murder, as well as in the days surrounding her death. We'll talk about that here in a moment. But I do want to talk about what happened after Christa died. Lee was arrested 5 days later, and police charged him with capital murder. Here he is making his first appearance in court in Houston in 2024 per KHOU TV. A judge set the bond at $1 million. Now that is a lot of money, but Lee was able to post it with a surety bond the same month as the alleged murder of his wife. Lee has been out of jail ever since, but he was required to wear a GPS monitor. Now, how he was reportedly able to get out of the US this month and get to Italy, it's a big part of this story, and it involves that GPS monitor. And just wait until I tell you what he reportedly told authorities in Milan when he got there. Court documents are also now shedding light on what was going on in the supposed picture-perfect marriage in the years leading up to Christa's death. Last month, prosecutors filed a document laying out some of the evidence that they plan to use in Lee's upcoming trial, and it includes some bombshell allegations. Prosecutors say in March of 2024, roughly 6 months before Christa's death, Lee allegedly posted on Reddit that he was, quote, bored in his marriage, and this man, now 39 years old, wanted a college-aged female for a friends with benefits arrangement. Then prosecutors allege in the days surrounding his wife's alleged murder, on October 7th, the day of Christa's alleged murder, Lee bought a new Kia Telluride SUV without her allegedly knowing. Remember, it was 11:30 p.m. that night that Houston police were called to their house. Then you have on the 6th, that's the day before Christa's murder, Prosecutors say that two friends saw Lee at a local Houston bar, and it just appears that they believe that he was acting odd, because they say in the conversation at the bar that they had with him, Lee referred to his own young son as a derogatory term for people who are gay. Then a day before that, family members say Lee was acting off at a party that they were at. But then we really need to get to the behavior that Lee had after Christa's alleged murder, which prosecutors could use, frankly, as a foreshadowing for what he just allegedly did, fleeing ahead of his trial. On October 8th, the day after Christa's murder, prosecutors say that Lee claimed he was allegedly being set up and that he was being targeted. He also claimed he needed to leave the country, according to prosecutors. Lee claimed, allegedly, that he needed to do it to take care of himself. Now let's go to October 10th. Witnesses say that Lee alleged he needed to leave Houston. And he said this time he wanted to go back to his native South Carolina, prosecutors say, and he wanted to go back on the 12th, which is the same day that he was arrested. Prosecutors also say that Lee didn't let his kids speak with Christa's family. But perhaps the most damning anecdotes that prosecutors say they want to use during a trial goes back to 2023. Prosecutors alleged back in 2023, Lee had an affair with a woman in San Diego. Then, prosecutors say between April and May of 2025. So remember, this is while he is out on bond, accused of killing his pregnant wife. Lee contacted the same woman he allegedly had an affair with, and they say he talked about plans to flee to Mexico or other parts of the world. Lee allegedly said that he could remove his GPS monitor. He also allegedly talked to his alleged mistress about marriage and getting a new identity. He allegedly asked this woman if she knew of a Mexican identity he could acquire to help get him out of the country, prosecutors write. Now, it's important to note that the same month that prosecutors say this communication was happening in 2025, a Harris County, Texas grand jury indicted Lee on the charge of capital murder in the death of his wife. So let's talk about the evidence at this point. You have this autopsy that allegedly shows that Christa was strangled to death. And then you had these stories laying out a man who allegedly appeared to be unhappy in his marriage, but also seemed to be spiraling out of control. So now we're in 2026. And on May 4th, prosecutors filed a document accusing Lee of violating the conditions of his bond. They claim on May 1st, authorities got an alert from the GPS monitor that Lee was wearing that it had been tampered with just after 9 p.m. Authorities tried to get in touch with Lee, and they say they couldn't. Today, we spoke with Lee's attorney. His name is Dick DeGuerin. He's a high-profile defense attorney who has had some infamous clients in his career, like Robert Durst, who you might remember as the subject of the HBO true crime documentary, The Jinx. DeGuerin told us that Lee Gilley allegedly left the country, fleeing first to Canada and then flying all the way to Milan, Italy, and that is where Lee Gilley currently is in custody. Now, DeGuerin told us he's not sure when his client left the United States, and he also told us he's trying to get in touch with Lee Gilley, but he hasn't been able to speak with him as of yet. DeGuerin told KPRC-TV that when Lee landed in Milan, authorities seemed to not believe his identification information, and his attorney says he then self-identified, and Lee claimed that he was being wrongfully prosecuted in Texas and that he wanted asylum. An interesting part of this is the reason he may have gone to Italy compared to any other country. Why he would go to Italy is an interesting part of this that we're going to talk about with our guest here in just a moment, because when Lee landed in Italy, he allegedly claimed that he was subject to the death penalty. I want you to remember that. Lee is facing a charge of capital murder, but DeGuerin told KPRC prosecutors never said they were seeking the death penalty in this case. Gilley's next court date is slated for June 5th. Join us now to talk more about this case and the process of getting Lee Gilley back to the United States is Eric Faddis, criminal defense attorney. Always good to have you here on Law and Crime. So Lee Gilley, he is in custody in Milan, Italy. There's a lot to talk about with how he was even able to get to Italy in the first place. But now, what is the process of getting him back to Houston?
Sure, Chris. So this is a rather involved extradition process. It's going to involve not only the state of Texas, but also likely the federal government. It's really a diplomatic type of process whereby our federal government has to get in touch with Italy. There are a number of requirements that have to be met in order for Italy to be willing to extradite the defendant back to America, back to Texas. Like I said, that's a rather involved process, and I imagined that measures are being taken towards that end right now.
So his attorney tells some local television stations about how this apparently went down to his knowledge. Lee Gilley, at some point, it's unclear when, he flies from the US to Canada or gets to Canada, and then he flies to Italy. He gets to the checkpoint in Italy, and there was something, it just seemed off, apparently, to Italian authorities with his identification. And that's when he says he's being wrongfully prosecuted in the United States, and he would like to claim asylum. How does that, and we talk a lot about asylum these days, across a lot of different fronts, certainly the political realm, how that works out. But in this situation, how does that work when someone shows up at a checkpoint at an airport and says, I want to claim asylum?
you know, um, that there is a higher threshold for asylum in most countries than just I have a criminal case against me and I think I'm being wrongfully accused. That's probably not going to cut it. Usually, there's a formal legal process whereby someone has to submit documentation showing persecution. Oftentimes, it's relating to persecution of ethnic or political groups. There has to be a threat of death or serious bodily harm. All these things have to be documented for the receiving country to then process the asylum request. But simply, showing up, getting stopped, and saying, "Hey, there's a case against me that I think is bogus," that's not going to be enough.
Yeah, and so now he is going to come back, we assume, to the United States at some point in time. We don't know why Italy was the place he would go. But that seems to be a country that has a pretty decent relationship with the United States. I mean, what type of hurdles, I guess, would going to Italy as opposed to, if you flew to Moscow, I assume getting him back to the US would be a little bit more difficult. Just what stands out to you about the fact that that's the country that he went to?
A few important points on that, Chris. So, look, there are some countries that typically do not extradite. My understanding is Vietnam. If a person goes to Vietnam, they're likely not going to be sent back. With Italy, the reason that I think he chose Italy is because they have a condition in terms of extradition whereby if a person is facing the death penalty,
Hmm.
then Italy might be much more reluctant to extradite that person. And Italy, to my understanding, requires assurances that even if the individual is subject to the death penalty, the prosecutor is not going to seek it. Once Italy has those assurances that the individual being extradited won't be put to death, my understanding is they're much more inclined to engage in that extradition process. And I think it's likely that they will send this defendant back.
That's interesting because I know his attorney also said that at this point, prosecutors in Texas, they haven't said whether or not they were going to pursue the death penalty in this case. He is facing a capital murder charge. It's almost like now at this point, if he was really concerned about the death penalty, like this could be something that could work in his favor, that he was actually able to get to Italy.
Perhaps, like I said, I think that's why he probably chose Italy. I've read some reports about the case. My impressions were that the DA was not going to seek the death penalty, even though the charge is theoretically subject to the death penalty. If the prosecutors essentially write up some letter saying, "Hey, Italy, we're not going to seek to kill this person," I think that's probably going to be enough to overcome that hurdle with respect to the death penalty. But if this was a capital case and they were seeking the death penalty, this guy might have more outs and it might be more likely that he would remain in Italy. But I think under the circumstances, that's unlikely.
Yeah, no, that's certainly an interesting dynamic. And then just before we get to how it could play into his impending trial and how this all goes from here, how was he able to get from, because if you're facing the charges that he's facing, he obviously has this GPS monitor that he took off. Are you surprised that, I think of the checkpoints, and even if he was able to get into Canada, I don't know if he drove to Canada. We don't really know about that part of it, but he was able to get, over a border somehow out of Texas and then to Italy, that there was no flagging along the way until apparently he had some identification that seemed a little sketchy to the folks in Italy when he got there.
I'm surprised, Chris, that he wasn't stopped before that. I'm surprised he made it all the way overseas to my homeland of Italy. Usually what happens, especially if a GPS monitor is cut off, there's a notification that's sent to the entity that is supervising that. Oftentimes, there is a warrant for that person's arrest that is issued in very short order. And then when an individual is traveling, especially internationally, there are officials who are looking to see whether any of the individuals coming into the country have a warrant for their arrest, and they're often stopped. Look, Chris, I've had clients who were on probation who didn't even have a warrant. They were simply traveling and had a court order granting them that permission to travel, and they were stopped and questioned for a long period of time. So the fact that he made it all the way to Italy is rather surprising to me.
Yeah, it really is, because I know the GPS monitor, I guess there was something that was tipped off around 9 p.m. on one night, but it's like, even if he drove to get there, like, you would think that that would have triggered some sort of alert, and then you would have had a good period of time to get to it. Now that he's in custody, eventually he'll come back. If and when this goes to trial, how does the fact that this man facing these charges, and of course the evidence that we'll talk about in a little bit, how does all of this factor into how a jury could look at him?
I think there are two potential spins, two potential interpretations, one from the prosecution, one from defense. Prosecution is going to say this is consciousness of guilt. This is a person who knew that the walls were closing in on them in terms of a very serious homicide charge and tried to skedaddle, tried to abscond, tried to flee the jurisdiction so he wouldn't be caught, because he knew he did something wrong and he knew he was likely to be convicted. So he has that consciousness of guilt. Defense, as you mentioned, his attorney, very talented Dick DeGuerin, he's a high-profile defense attorney, has stated that the motivation for the defendant leaving the country was that he was scared. And, perhaps if a person's being wrongly accused of the most serious crime there is, it's not unreasonable to think that they might be freaked out and might try to take some, sort of spur-of-the-moment abrupt measures to try to avoid what they believe is a wrongful prosecution. So it's going to depend on what interpretation the jury finds most reasonable in light of all the other circumstances.
So I know the prosecutors a couple of weeks ago, they had put in this document laying out some of the, I guess, anecdotes that they could include in their case against Lee Gilley. And it seems like, at least from what prosecutors are saying, from the very beginning, he was thinking about getting out of town. He had in just a day or two after had made some comments about maybe fleeing Texas, going back to South Carolina, going, to some other country. And then, of course, you have in 2025, right as he is indicted on this, he's talking to his alleged mistress about maybe Mexico, maybe somewhere else. How does all of that kind of go in with now the fact that he allegedly actually did leave the country?
If I'm the prosecutor, those are little gems that I'm going to present to this jury at trial, because it shows what was going on in this person's mind. And from the prosecutor's perspective, like I said, it's consciousness of guilt. It's a guy who knows he's guilty, who's trying to avoid the ultimate outcome of being put in a box for the rest of his life. And he's willing to take extreme measures like absconding from the jurisdiction, leaving his country, and considering multiple other countries. I think when a jury looks at that, they're more likely to conclude that this person thought they were guilty and was trying to get away, as opposed to this person is totally being persecuted and wrongfully accused, and that's why they did it. There are other things he could have done if he's being wrongfully accused, like present a compelling defense.
And on that front with the defense, and yeah, he has a high profile attorney. This is someone who's has handled cases like this before. When you have, and I think in true crime, when people hear that there was allegations of infidelity and some of the things that you read in that document, a lot of the folks in the comments section are going to say, there he is. I mean, I have no idea whether he did it. He's certainly presumed innocent. But I mean, as for a prosecutor, when you have that, and you can say, hey, in 2023, this was someone who was stepping out on his wife, and then he goes back to continue to talking to this person, like, that infidelity part of it in domestic violence cases, like, how strong evidence can that be in cases like this?
There is surely a risk, Chris, that the jury's going to look at that and say, What is the motivation that this person would have to off his wife? Well, possibly the motivation is that he wanted to be with someone else. And instead of divorce, instead of separation, instead of a more traditional measure, he took it to the extreme. I think a jury might look at that and say, hey, that goes to motive. That gives this guy a reason to want to get rid of his wife because he wants to be with someone new. Now, certainly there are counter arguments to that, but I think there's a risk that the jury's going to see it that way.
Because also, when you go through like the indictment, doctors believe that this was a woman who was strangled to death. And apparently there's medical evidence and autopsy that'll show that. And then, I wonder for you as a criminal defense attorney, like when you're facing that and there's the medical, because there's the part of it is saying like, look, maybe he was bored in his marriage. Doesn't mean he killed his wife. When it seems like she was strangled to death, how do you push back on that in defending a client?
You know, one thing to be mindful of is that the prosecution has their own experts and they talk with these folks. Sometimes they have personal relationships with these folks, and these experts are not necessarily 100% impartial. Oftentimes they have an interest in what the outcome is going to be. Oftentimes they might have a lens through which they view certain evidence, and that colors their interpretation. Strangulation is an opinion. It's an opinion by one medical expert, but defense, it wouldn't be uncommon for them to hire their own strangulation expert, perhaps for them to even do their own autopsy, to conduct an in-depth investigation and say, wait a sec, that first opinion on strangulation is wrong because of X, Y, and Z. And so I think when people hear about these medical examiner reports, they say, oh, that must be gospel. That must be a medical fact. And it's not necessarily the case.
Yeah, and I mean, I think even very, very different situation. Jeffrey Epstein, prime example of in some cases they'll say one thing happened, but then others will say others. Not trying to open that rabbit hole, go down that rabbit hole today. In this story, he is slated to go on trial. I'm just looking at KPRC in Houston. June 8th was the latest trial date that was set. The fact he's in Italy, and you think of the extradition process of going back, maybe the hurdles that are now in place with what he did. I mean, what do you think the timeline might look like going forward?
Yeah, good question. What Italy is going to want to see is they're going to want to see the complaint listing out the charges. They're going to want to see the affidavit in support of probable cause. They're going to want some assurance that this guy, that there's significant evidence against this guy. Oftentimes in extradition, if there is no probable cause determined by the receiving country, if the receiving country says, hey, I don't think there is a shred of evidence supporting this prosecution, that can make extradition a lot harder. So the government has to provide those materials. Italy has to review them. They have to make logistical arrangements for transferring a person in custody charged with murder back to another country. I think we're looking at weeks. Will it lead to a continuance of the trial date? I think that there's a reasonable likelihood it will.
And then just lastly, when he was arrested, police charge him with capital murder. He has his first court appearance. Bond was set at $1 million, and then he posts a surety bond for $1 million, and he's able to get out. Knowing that, I mean, how common is it for a capital murder defendant to actually be able to be out for as long as he's been out? I mean, I know now the bond's been revoked, and when you flee the country, that changes things. But just in general, it seems surprising that someone facing that charge would be able to spend time at home on a GPS monitor as opposed to being in pretrial detention.
It's rather uncommon, Chris. In Colorado, where I primarily practice, the judge has the discretion to not give a bond at all when the highest level homicide charge has been levied. And so the fact that the judge granted a bond and this person apparently had the resources to assist a surety in posting it, that's pretty uncommon to be able to fight a homicide charge from the outside. But like you said, all that's going to go away. The bond's going to be revoked. He's going to owe the bonds person gobs and gobs of money. On top of that, he'll likely be charged with violation of bail bond conditions. On top of that, this is a fact that arguably shows consciousness of guilt. He's dug himself an even bigger hole that he'll have to try to climb out of once this trial commences.
And actually, you bring up a good point. That probably should have been one of my first questions. He posted a surety bond. Like, how does the fact that he then fled, allegedly, impact like the financial situation of how that whole world works?
Totally. So how it usually works, Chris, is let's say in this case, there's $1 million bond. Defendant goes to a surety and says, hey, I can't post $1 million. Can you help me post this? The surety says, hey, we need at least 20% of that, $200,000. Defendant gives the surety that money. Defendant promises that they will appear at each future court date, because that's what the surety is essentially promising the judge. And so when that condition is violated, that bond is revoked. The surety is likely out that money and has to try to recover it personally from the defendant, which it sounds like they likely never will. So it's a tremendous mess, and this guy is never going to be granted a bond again should he somehow get some traction in this case. He's going to be behind bars for a long time, and even the violation of bail bonds condition usually carries significant incarceration as well.
Yeah, you bring up the fact he went to Italy, and that probably will end any future bond conversation. Eric Faddis, criminal defense attorney. Great to talk about this case with you. Thanks for being here.
Always a pleasure.
That will do it for On the Case, presented by Law&Crime. Subscribe to us on YouTube and Spotify, and we're also streaming on Peacock. I'm Chris Stewart. We'll see you next time.